So again, welcome everyone. Just want to introduce Ted. He's the Associate Director of the Elfreths Alley Museum. He earned his master's degree at Temple University in Public History, writing a thesis about historic house museums. During his time in Philadelphia, Ted has worked as a tour guide at Eastern State Penitentiary, a freelance researcher, and he served as an intern at the National Park Service. So we want to thank him again for stepping in tonight. Unfortunately, our lecturer from the African American Museum couldn't make it. So Ted stepped in, and we all love Elfreths Alley. Ted, Elfreths Alley is near and dear to many of us. It's how I started, guiding. Ed drew me in down there, Ed Major. So a lot of us have a lot of connections, a lot of love for it. So without any further, I'll turn it over to you. And again, as always, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll save them till the end, and then ask Ted about our questions will be brought up.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I know some of you quite well. I know some of you a little well, and many more of you I'd like to know better. But what Rick suggested I do tonight is I'm going to offer sort of an overview of what our museum has been doing recently, and then talk about some of the things we wanted to do that have been derailed because of the pandemic, and some of the things that we've chosen to do during the pandemic, and then sort of where we're going from there. And then if we have time, I'll talk through some resources, strategies, and some even research notes that I've been working on, just as a, sharing what I know kind of a thing. And right now, before I jump into presenting mode, I'm going to drop some links in the chat that my slides will refer to if you're wondering how to get there. Okay, let me see if I can share here. Oh, whoever's the host, can you allow me to share my screen?
Yes, I will do that. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Selected.
There we go. Thank you. Okay. So, how do I do this? There we go. So you all are familiar with Elfreths Alley, or many of you are. Our street dates from the early 18th century, and for most of the last century, it's been strongly associated with that period, the 18th century, the colonial time. People often talk about it transporting people back in time, or being untouched, those kinds of things. But it's actually a little more complicated because people still live here. And so really one of the things we have is a really long continuous streak of residential history in the street, and urban history on the street. Those comments about being transported back in time, one of the ironic things is that the street has actually been changed to look more colonial at multiple times, most drastically right in the run up to the bicentennial. So one of the things that we have been doing for the last 20 years now, almost, in small ways, is trying to think about how to extend the period of significance, the periods of time that are relevant at the site and that we talk about at the site. So some of these have really made it into our programming. Some of these have been really internal conversations. But beginning in 2002, the museum instigated an oral history project to people who had lived on the street. To my knowledge, nothing has really happened with that. But in our archive, we do have some reminiscences from past residents. In around about 2007, there was an exhibit on Irish immigration put up on weatherproof panels. Many of you have seen that. I think originally it was put on construction fencing. Now it sits in the museum garden. And then just about almost a decade ago now, I guess. Deirdre Kelleher did some significant archaeological work, both in house number 129, but more significantly behind the museum houses. And the intent of these has been to sort of investigate those stories after the colonial period. And so I think with the Irish immigration piece, we've sort of moved to the end of the 19th century. But I really think there's some really interesting 20th century stories on the street as well. So we talk about industry. We have the stove factory at number 128. This street was really adjacent to a lot of heavy industry in the early 20th century, even into the mid 20th century. Could talk about the Great Migration and changing racial demographics in the city of Philadelphia. We have a lot of immigrant stories, but we also have some migrant stories. And so I look forward to sort of incorporating those a little more. One of the most basic things that we have on the street are houses, and houses that have changed a lot over time, and the kinds of folks who were living in them and how they were living in them changed quite a lot over time. So I think of these houses as a really great resource to think about housing issues in the city and the greater area as a whole. You know, in the early 20th century, these houses were really quite old. They were in not great shape, but they were being lived in by more people than ever before. And that connects to a lot of bigger stories. But then, of course, we have the preservation story. So the role of people like the Elfreths Alley Association, as well as other people and organizations working in preservation. And there's some sort of national stories here as well. In the fall of 2019, we opened a little temporary exhibit that we hope will come back at some point called Sketches, Miniatures, and Walking Tours, that talked about some federal projects that worked to preserve Philadelphia's history in some ways and promote Philadelphia's history, including the street. So the Historic American Building Survey, which came out of the Old Philadelphia Survey, was originally a local program, but was sort of bootstrapped into a federal program. The Museum Extension Project created a 7-foot model of Elfreths Alley, as well as like 2,600 miniatures of Independence Hall. And then the third piece of that exhibit was looking at the Philadelphia City Guide from 1937, which is one of the first tourist guides to our city, and it was created by the Works Progress Administration. That's available for free online if you've never looked at it. It's a really interesting resource, in part because it has something like 20 walking tours of Philadelphia. Now, those were walking tours designed with the 1930s in mind. Many of them aren't really walkable now, but always an interesting sort of angle. And my goal is to keep stretching that period of significance into the 20th century. So, whoops. Okay, so what we had hoped to accomplish in 2020, we had a lot of momentum coming from 2019, and I wrote a women's history tour. Several of you actually did trainings with me about how to deliver this tour. And this built on the story of the dressmakers who lived in number 126 in the 18th century, but then also included the story of a woman in 1880 working at a button factory, and women working to preserve the street in the 1930s and also in the 1960s. We had planned to take our annual Fete Day event, which typically has sort of a colonial theme, and sort of throw it into the 1930s era where that event actually came from. We were really working a lot on thinking about how to plan for the potential of number 128, the building right next to our museum, which has been basically uninhabitable for some time. We had some grants, we had a grant calendar worked out, all these kinds of things. And we'd also secured the services of 2 interns this past summer. One who had a grand scheme about replanting the garden with native plants, and one who was preparing to write a tour based on her research about the dressmakers. And all of these in their own way would have extended that period of significance. But then, of course, the pandemic sort of derailed a lot of that stuff. So I found myself working at home and trying to find something for two interns to do, working in their own homes. And so we wrote a podcast. We took all of the resources that we had, the women's tour, one of the interns, her research, and we plotted out an 8-episode season of a podcast and recorded it in our closets on our phones. And it was a really rewarding project, and one that I think of as having enduring value. We can use it as a training tool. We can use it when people visit the museum. If they have more questions, they can listen to the podcast and hear a little more. Our 2 annual fundraisers had to go virtual. Virtual Fet Day we did as a quote unquote live video experience. And thank you to our neighbors and many friends and sort of friends of friends who chipped in video for that project. For Deck the Alley, we did sort of a slow-mo video project where we released a video each week throughout November and December. Both of those you can find on our YouTube page. I dropped the links into the chat. And we were able to have limited museum tours in September and October as the city was sort of reopening a little. And we had to sort of try to streamline our museum experience and maximize our outdoor spaces. So we would send people through the first floor of 126 by themselves and try to have conversations with them in the garden or have conversations with them out front of the houses to minimize the time we were all indoors. And we did make a little bit of progress on number 128. One of the things we did right before the pandemic sort of locked us down was have engineers come and evaluate the building. One of the things they highlighted as an issue was loose stucco on the back east side of that building overlooking the museum garden. And we were able to, with the contributions of Premier Building Restoration Inc., they did a lot of work for us just pro bono, and not only knocked down the dangerous stucco, but replaced it. So we have dreams for that building going forward, but I'm really not sure what the timeline is on that. So that's sort of where we've been. And now to where we're going. So one of the projects that I'm working on this year is another season of our podcast. I was able this fall to work with a class of graduate students at Temple University in the program that I graduated from. And they worked in pairs to get research topics. They actually many of them performed interviews, and they wrote basically spec scripts for our podcast. We're gonna do a lot of work on those pitches, but we're not working from nothing this year. So we have sort of a starting place. And whereas the season 1 theme of the podcast became the contributions of women to the street, the theme of this season will be work. Each episode will focus on a different kind of labor. There you see 3 of the ones that the graduate students pitched. There are going to be a couple others as well. And one of them is going to actually help with additional research and recording and all those kinds of things. One of my hopes for this project, again, like season 1, is that it will be enduring, that it will have value beyond this year. I think that doing these focused episodes on a kind of labor or a trade will be of great value to us in the future as we think about what kind of programming we can offer, what kind of tours, exhibits, etc. But also to other people who are like yourselves as tour guides who are developing sort of content on various kinds of work and various aspects of the alley. And as a final note, we are looking for sponsors for this. So if you happen to know anyone who would like to sponsor a small local podcast, let me know. I have worked on a sponsorship pitch that I can send your way. Another thing that I'm really hoping to work on, get together before we can actually have people into the museum, is some sort of outdoor exhibit. What we found in our limited time when we were open this fall was that we really valued the time when we were outside with visitors because we felt safer, they felt safer. But we had relatively few sort of points of entry with them. When you're in the museum with a visitor, they look at something and they can ask you a question about it, or you can point something out and sort of offer a nugget of information. Outside, there were fewer of those obvious points of conversation. So I really want to do some kind of pop-up exhibit. Because I've just been reading a lot about these archaeological digs that were done about a decade ago, we'll probably use some of that, maybe some of the actual archaeological collections, but for sure, some of the ideas and some of the discoveries from that project. That intern last year who had made that planting plan, that plan is still good. We still have those seeds. So we'll probably replant the back garden this spring as well, and hope to have some interpretive signage so that the garden can really be the main space in which we interact with visitors this summer, even if everybody is vaccinated and everybody's healthy, because I think the outdoor interpretation is going to be important, and that will require some good interpreters. So if any of you are looking for a new venue to talk to people about local history, let me know. I know that the pandemic is not the greatest time to jump into a new thing necessarily. So if you have reservations about that, I'm happy to talk through our safety protocols. But also I hope that at some point you might be able to come help us out. Okay, so that's sort of where we're going. But I realized that some of you may not have gotten the inside view of what I do in some cases, and what people at this museum in generations past have done in terms of researching. And one thing that we actually have quite a few resources that are available just from your computer, from the internet. So one thing that I recently read through more thoroughly, it's long, it's a bit of a slog, but is this dissertation about the archaeology project at Elfreths Alley. You probably don't want to read all of it, but there are selections there that are really worth reading, and there's some really great images, and I think Kelleher's sort of conclusions about the alley and the museum and urban life in the 19th century are really worth checking out. If anybody would like a copy of that, a PDF of that, I can send out. Let me know and I can email it to you. And then there are quite a few resources available online, especially US censuses and directories. I use familysearch.com, the sort of freer version of Ancestry. It doesn't have all of the collections that Ancestry.com has, but it gets you to the censuses and to some other resources. And a lot of the Philadelphia city directories, though by no means all of them, are available, have been digitized by the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And if you go to archive.org, you can find those from about 1785 through to 1867, 1868, something like that. And then one of the really interesting things I am happy to share with you is this database that I've been assembling. And this was something I did a lot of work on right at the beginning of the pandemic when I didn't feel like I had much other things to work on. But I've been trying to sort of take all of that data and put it into a workable space into a smart sheet, and it's very much in progress. It doesn't contain all of the records that I have by any means, but if you're ever looking for a resident of the street, or you want to know what work people were doing on the alley in 1835, that's a great resource, and I'll keep adding to that, hopefully. Although currently that smart sheet is at it's filled, so we have to figure out how to grow it a little bigger. But check that out. And using that, here are some stories that I've been really excited about from the alley's history that do that, that I think have connections to the colonial era while being 20th century stories. So here is part of the 1930 census for Elfreths Alley. This is just the people who are in the household at number 135. And if you listened to season 1 of our podcast, these folks come up in a lot of the later episodes. This household had Robert and Gladys and Goldie Morton, Charles and Eleanor Wilson, and Nettie McCrae and her infant son, Robert. All of the people living in this house were Black. They were the only Black residents of Elfreths Alley in 1930. And I don't know how coincidental this is. They paid by far the highest rent of anyone on the alley. They paid $50 a month when the going rent was really around $25. Now, they were in the largest house on the street, so that may explain that to some extent. Robert Morton and Nettie McCrae both had migrated north. I believe Nettie came from Virginia and Robert came from North Carolina. So they were part of that great migration of Black Southerners coming north in the early 20th century. Both Robert and Charles worked at a shovel factory, and Nettie McCrae worked at a garment factory. So they were also connected to the industrialization of this area. The fact that 3 households were living together in one house pays testament to the overcrowding of a place like Old City in 1930. And shortly after these folks lived in number 135, within 10 years, that building was condemned. But before it was demolished, it was saved and turned into the Coach House restaurant, which is the second restaurant, at least, to be on the street in the 20th century, and really played up the historic ambiance. So they may have moved off the street for other reasons, but certainly by 1947, that house was more valuable as a historically themed restaurant than as a home. So that's one story. And I have not been able to find any of these individuals in any other records, which is very frustrating to me. I'd love to learn more about each and every one of these people. But somebody that I've been looking into very recently, who left much more of a trail, is a man named Harry Hurst. So Harry Hurst was born in 1895 in Pennsylvania. His parents had both immigrated from Germany a little earlier. He was the second youngest out of 6, I believe. They lived near Kensington when they first when he first arrived on the U.S. Census in 1900, I guess. And then they moved to the house that I've circled on this little map here, 515 Hamilton Street, which is now part of the Target, just south of Spring Garden, just north of Callow Hill. And both Harry and his father, Friedrich, worked as laborers, just day laborers, getting work wherever they could. For that reason, when they appear in censuses, they often have they work in very different places, 10 years to 10 years, and probably day to day, year to year, worked in different settings. Harry left quite a trail in the historical record, just even from what I was able to get online. I imagine that when I am able to go to an in-person archive in the future, in the after times, that I will be able to learn more about Harry. But one thing that I found was a notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer, I believe, in 1916, one of the Philadelphia papers at any rate, that he had secured a license to marry a woman named Mary Zoller. Now, we don't know if he actually went through with that marriage, but 4 years later, he married Florence Kessler. 4 year later on the census, he was living with his parents in the family home, even though he was, 25 at that point. But in that year, he also married Florence Kessler in Elkton, Maryland. Now, some of you may know Elkton, Maryland. It was the quickie wedding capital of the East Coast for many, many years. So it's very possible that that second marriage happened in a hurry, possibly without parental approval. But why am I talking about these people? 515 Hamilton is not Elfreths Alley. Well, by 1930, Harry and Florence and their 4 kids were renting the tenement behind number 126, our museum house. Now, the residents of 135 that same year were paying $50 a month to rent number 135. These folks were paying $8 a month to rent basically a very narrow trinity tucked behind number 126 Elfreths Alley. Now, this picture on this slide is from the archaeological excavations of that back garden. And when they first found this wall, the first spot that they dug in, they found that it was only two bricks thick. And yet all of the fire insurance maps had shown that this was a 3-story building. And they thought, well, maybe the fire insurance maps got it wrong. Subsequent excavations showed that it was actually thicker, that the foundation was actually thicker in the corners, which suggested to the archaeologists that it was a cheaply built, and I think she used the word improvisationally built building, probably quite substandard in its construction. It also incorporated a privy into the structure, so that the first floor room was smaller, and then the second and third floor rooms actually sort of overhung a small privy that had an outdoor entrance. But it would have been very close quarters to all of the vapors and smells and good things like that came from a privy. And at that point, Harry was working as a laborer in I would assume a nearby machine shop. 10 years later, they had moved down the street to number 137. Were renting for a little more. It was a nicer house. And he was working on a works progress administration project. Now, I don't know what project that was. I'm trying to find out. But perhaps they'd come up in the world a little bit. It's also worth noting that in that period, in between 1930 and 1940, the back tenement of 126 was, all of 126 was condemned within that period. And in the process of making it habitable or considered passing the city's approval, they probably demolished the back tenement. So the Hursts may have been the last residents of that back tenement. Now, 1940, Harry Hurst was 45 years old. He was still working as a laborer. In the previous year, he had only worked about half of the year and brought in about $300. So if you run the numbers on that, about half, maybe a little over half of his money probably was going to rent. He still had 3 children living at home. It was not a comfortable lifestyle by any means. So that's where I am with Harry Hurst. Because the 1940 census is the last publicly available one, I have to wait another year until the 1950 census passes into public access. I hope to learn more about him. I did some newspaper searches, sort of half hoping I'd find his obituary somewhere that would give me some more biographical details, but I haven't found them. But I share these two stories for a couple reasons. One is that as we continue to look at the 19th century and the 20th century as really key parts of our story here on the street, there's a lot of through lines. When we were writing season 1 of the podcast, we found lots of through lines in terms of the role of women, especially in garment manufacturing. But there's another through line, which is that a lot of the people who lived on the street were performing what was considered unskilled labor. That is besides the point that many of them were performing labor that was not recognized as labor in households and those kinds of informal labor. But even those who were working wage labor, many of them were doing it in settings that were considered unskilled. Straight through from Peter Bicknell in 1785 to Harry Hurst in 1940. And I think there's a lot more to sort of unpack there. We like to talk about the street as a street of artisans, but if we look at the numbers, many more people were working pretty brutish lives. And there's lots more to learn. And there's much more that we can try to make, the word I used here was legible to visitors to the street. I think one of the challenges we still have is that because it does feel like an immersive space, it does feel like this is how this must have been 300 years ago. I think it's really hard to sort of make the intervening years read to people who are visiting the street. Yeah, they'll see the recycling bins. Yes, they'll see Kermit the Frog in number 132's window, or 130's window. But they sort of jump from 1776 to 2021. And so one of the challenges I see for us as a museum going forward is figuring out ways to unpack that intervening history and try to make it more visible and make it more accessible to folks.